I am very pleased that the organization that, God, we have all been associated for many years, they finally asked me to dinner, basically. And I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate all of you for coming out and just hearing us talk a little about some of the films that I've worked on. And I hope you can come away with something that would be useful for you in your careers.
I think what really struck me about after we talked extensively is that you are very socially conscious. You have a lot of heart as a person, and it really shows itself in your work. But the other thing is your journey, which we're going to talk about, which is pretty amazing. You started first editing and shooting media 51 years ago. And you've gone through so many fascinating eras in film and the evolution of our society and film in general. And what struck me about you is how beautifully you really absorb all these experiences that were so very different, not only in documentaries as well as features, but also the different styles of the directors, the personalities, and you always were very much absorbing very specific lessons from these experiences, and we're going to talk about that now, and I think it's very exciting. So, first of all, I think certainly a very much a part of who you are is the fact that you had parents that were Chinese immigrants. In fact, your mother was a bride that your father brought back from China who didn't speak the language, and it was very difficult for her to live in this culture, and that I'm sure your empathy level, partly for different kinds of people and kinds of lifestyle and that sort of social awareness came out of that empathy that you grew up with, and also being an inner city LA school kid. But I also want to, and then you were a philosophy major at UCLA, which is interesting. You said you learned a bit about logic and maybe problem solving. And then an immigrant's parents' dream, you went to Harvard Law School. Well, guess what? So I want you to tell us about, this was quite an epiphany you had, that you were all set to do this, and then you saw a film that changed your life. Can you tell us about that?
As you can imagine, most of you, as you go on in school, you begin to question what you're studying, why you're studying, what are your career goals. And basically, I think at your late teens or early 20s, you want to somehow find a field that you can feel fulfilled in and to achieve a goal greater than yourself in your life. And when I made the choice to go to law school and found out almost immediately that I didn't fit into that way of thinking. I didn't fit into the competitiveness of other eager first-year law students, especially at Harvard Law, where it drew people that wanted to go into corporate law, work on Wall Street, work in the Justice Department, do something really great. And I was just, this kind of lost guy coming out of the West Coast, not having fit into the backgrounds that most of those people had. And I entered in the class of 1964. I was 2 years old at the time. And I was, really, really smart for a 2-year-old, but not smart enough. So I saw this picture. I was very unhappy in my first year of law school. And, the 60s was a time of really fomentation of American independent cinema. And I saw this film in New York on one of my weekends where I escaped from Cambridge. And in New York, I saw this film called Nothing But a Man. And it was a small picture even at that time, but it starred Ivan Dixon and Abbey Lincoln. And neither were well known as actors. Abbey Lincoln was known in New York as being a jazz singer. And Ivan Dixon had a lot of stage parts, but not in film. And it was, imagine this, it was in 1964 that I saw this, and it was probably made 2 years before that. But it was about a young African-American couple. The guy was a railroad worker, And he was courting Abby Lincoln, who was the daughter of a pastor in this small town in the South. And there was resistance from the father to the romance because the railroad worker wasn't, he was blue collar, he was working class, so he wasn't good enough for the daughter. So anyway, within this background, this is the first film that I had seen that told the stories of people of color, that painted them in human terms and not in stereotypes. Because up to that time, wherever you see either black people, brown people, yellow people, they were always like playing a stereotype. Flower Drum Song or Porgy and Bess, all this stuff. And it really just kind of never encouraged me to want to work in movies. But when I saw Nothing But a Man, it was a story that was so compelling for me, that drew me in, that I thought, maybe there's something in this medium that I might want to be a part of, to be able to tell the stories of people that the majority might feel those are the others. They're they. And I've always kind of hated that notion of the they, those people. And I thought, I'm those people. And this was a film, even though I wasn't black, but at least I could see in this movie that it was about those people. And I wanted to learn how to work in film so I can tell the stories of those people.
And you ended up meeting one of the directors who was had been a Harvard student, Robert Young, and he ended up giving you an opportunity to, this is when you first got exposed to media, working in Seattle at a very progressive news. I mean, you did documentaries for them as well. But I love the story about what I call your boot camp for editing. This is pretty unbelievable. Once you got through that, I think you were sort of, I can deal with anything. So I was wondering if you could describe, so it was the 6 o'clock news, and you were doing short films about kind of trivial human interest stuff that was local news stuff, but what you had to do to make it on that deadline and make these short films, with hot splicing, I don't know if you all know what hot splicing is, but there were a lot of aspects of it, but just describe like your day, like what you had to do.
So this was my first job, as Bobbie was describing, that I got was for a Seattle television station. And because I did not go to film school, did not have any experience, they assigned me with a 16 millimeter camera. And in those days, in 1966, news was shot on black and white negative film. And so I would be assigned to go out and shoot the story, for instance, of Bobo the gorilla's 15th birthday at the Woodland Park Zoo, a highlight of my life. And you shoot this, and Bobo the gorilla is like, they give him a birthday cake of a bunch of bananas, and he would throw them all against the glass in the front. And I got to film that. So then I would take that film and I would run it to the lab, and they would develop it, and then I would pick it up again, and then bring it back to the newsroom, where I got to roll through the rewinds and a movie scope viewer, all this, the 16 millimeter footage that I shot of Bobo the gorilla in negative, and then I was assigned Chew, make a 45-second story out of Bobo the gorilla's birthday. So I got to, the synchronizer was just a timer that counted the frames and obviously the seconds. And I would then hot splice these different shots in order to tell this story. So I got to do like 1 or 2 stories every day for like 6 months, which was like my film school boot camp experience. Eventually, they promoted me to be able to do editing with sound. So I got to do short films every day for 6 months.
And then you went on to do more documentary work for another unit that they had formed. And then this is really interesting too, you worked on a short film called The Redwoods that won an Oscar for Best Short Documentary Film. And you were part of a 3-man crew where you were editing and the cinematographer, one of 3 people doing all those things. And you said that you also worked on Woodstock as a cameraman and on Janice.
7 by that time.
Must have been heady stuff, I mean, to experience all this. And you were reaching out to various documentary filmmakers trying to make a connection, and you had met someone named David Myers, who was a renowned documentary cameraman, who was telling you about a company that you may have heard of called Zoetrope, with 3 people, one of Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, and another man named John Corda.
John Cordy.
Cordy, yes, John Cordy.
Right.
So what happened? You made a connection. The other 2, the sort of famous ones, didn't answer you, but John Cordy did, who's not as well known, but a very respected filmmaker. And you ended up working on a documentary about Imogen Cunningham, right, with him.
Right.
And then how did you get to the point of meeting Walter Murch?
Oh, so just to show you how, like Steve was saying earlier about, we each have our own path. We each find our own opening. And for me, I was very fortuitous all along the way, whether it was Bob Young, who met with me and helped me find my first job. I looked him up from Nothing But a Man. I met him in a coffee shop in New York. He led me to a job in Seattle where I got to film Bobo the Gorilla. And then at Woodstock, I met David Myers. And here it is in the madness of Woodstock of that weekend. And between acts, I found out that David Myers lived in San Francisco. And I was looking for a way to expand my work bases outside of Seattle, because in 1969, Seattle was a very backward kind of, I wouldn't say backwards, but they were behind the times, and it wasn't very hip like it is now. And so he told me that in San Francisco there was this new company forming called American Zoetrope, with these 3 principles that Bobbie mentioned. And I did apply. I wrote these letters saying I was a documentary cameraman and editor. Do you have any openings? John Cordy hired me to edit documentaries. So I'm just working down the hall now from George Lucas and Walter Murch, who at that time was just finishing Lucas's first feature, THX 1138. And then I continued to, so I met them, and I was editing other documentaries that even Coppola had gotten money to produce short films about housing for the poor and so on. And by that time, American Graffiti was in post-production. This is like flash forward, like 2 years later. And Walter was doing the sound for American Graffiti. He was coming up with these really ingenious ways of re-recording the music that was in the cars that you would hear in that picture, and to what he called worldize it, he had his special treatments. And at that time, after the success of the first Godfather, Coppola had a hiatus, and Paramount said you could do any film you want, as long as it doesn't exceed $2 million in budget. So Coppola had this script that he had sitting on his desk for like 6 or 7 years called The Conversation. And he always had in mind, as he wrote it, it had a lot of sound kind of memory or flashbacks to sound. And so when he wrote it, he thought, oh, this is a young guy, Walter Murch, that could cut it. Well, Walter was busy with American Graffiti, so because he was familiar with me being down the hall editing documentaries, he asked whether I would put together the first cut of The Conversation. And so that's how my feature career started, was that I was editing documentaries down the hall, and because the guy that it was intended for was busy doing something else, he kind of handed the reins to me, at least for the first 6 months.
But this is what is so interesting, too, because you talking about a lesson you learned here. Oh. So you were talking about being a documentary filmmaker, and you take this footage and create some sort of narrative structure, and you were very tuned into, oh, you got a screenplay, you're going to just edit this according to the screenplay. So you put it all together, and that's all you do. You just have to follow the screenplay. So then what you talked about, what you discovered from Walter's, no, you don't actually have to do that. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. Coming from documentaries, we were always trying to impose a linear narrative on the story. And at least coming out of that time, that was what was almost a requirement. You got to straighten out, from all this documentary footage to be able to tell a story in a linear fashion. Well, the conversation presented me a story that could be rejiggered and can be told in a nonlinear way. And that was a huge discovery for me as a new editor, that, you can move scenes around. I didn't know that was permissible.
But also the opportunity, because there's so much, if you know the movie, it's first of all, the sound design really was revolutionary in film, and the psychological use of sort of paranoia and subjectivity and inside this Gene Hackman character. But also, as you said, there's a lot of insert shots and dials and tape recorders going. So Walter Murch was showing you how he could fashion that and have more fluidity or plasticity of a scene by using all this footage, and that was an interesting.
Well, for sure that was a good schooling experience for me, because I tried to find, at least in my early films, because of the situations I was in, the people that I got to work with, I acquired so much exposure to different editing devices. And the conversation was one where I learned the tools of being nonlinear. My next experience was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I got to work along with editors Lindsay Klingman and Sheldon Kahn. Our director was Milos Forman, and I learned so much more even from working with Milos, in the sense that in documentaries, at least in those days, you tried to avoid jump cuts, because you're filming, say, a person talking, and you got to cut to later on in the conversation, and then later on in the conversation. And to cover these up, you cut to somebody else in the room nodding their head, like you see in news constantly, to cover up the jump cut. And so I always thought, as when you cut to someone that isn't speaking, that it was just merely as a cutaway. Whereas in working on Cuckoo's Nest, with Milos, what I learned from Milos was that even though the scene was between, say, Jack Nicholson and Louise Fletcher, Randall P. McMurphy and the big nurse, that we could be telling a whole other story or other stories by how we use these cuts of reactions of all the other characters sitting around in a group therapy session. So it was a character revelatory way of narrative as well. Using cuts to people not speaking, but listening or reacting to what is being said, was continuing the narrative, but on different levels.
And it was a linear narrative, because you had this escalating tension, and it would play out. And showing the other characters did depict that as well.
Right. So, like in early scenes, you might see the character Billy Bibbit reacting in certain ways you don't realize until maybe 4 scenes later, an hour later, that why he was reacting that way was because of his suicidal tendencies or something like that. But the thing is that to learn how to set up a character, even though that character doesn't have any dialogue.
And you were also talking, this is another lesson in working with different personalities and different styles of methods of working, and Milos Forman is he's shoulder to shoulder, very exacting, very different from your experience on the conversation. You also talked about the overlap. Do you want to talk about the dialogue overlap that Milos?
Coming out of the kind of straight-laced documentaries I did of that time, you want to make every line clear and let it play out. But, Milos also showed me how you could use, especially in the group therapy sessions, how not only you can accelerate the scene, but you can escalate the tension by overlapping dialogue. And that was the first time that I learned how to use that. That you actually editorially overlap the dialogue, not just because the actors did it. So editorially, we did this on film, you can actually advance the incoming dialogue or extend the outgoing dialogue onto somebody else's dialogue, and you can overlap several dialogue tracks. And that was, to me, a device, a tool that I found that I could use later.
Yeah, and the momentum it creates and the sort of invisibility of an edit and all that. So then the next film you worked on, I don't know if you've heard of a movie called Star Wars. Can you talk about how you came to work on that film?
Oh, wow. George Lucas was unhappy at the conclusion of shooting in England. This is the very first Star Wars, in 1976.
And you were now 8 years old?
8 years old, like I said. No, actually, no. Like dogs, you got like the second year is you're really 11 years old. I was 15 by now. I was just the age for Star Wars. Actually, George had shown me the script before he went to England and asked if I, was available to work on it. And I read it and I thought, man, this is a script for 15-year-olds.
You thought it was strange. You said it read like a comic book.
It did. It did read like a comic. Because I grew up watching on late night TV these old serials, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and the dialogue of that script read derivative, of the dialogue from Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. But anyway, it didn't work out, the timing for me to work on it then. But after he filmed and wrapped shooting in England, he wasn't happy with the work of his original editor, who had cut A Hard Day's Night. And if you guys know that picture, A Hard Day's Night, I mean, talking about innovative jump cutting kind of, style. John Jimson, who had edited A Hard Day's Night, didn't quite work out for George. So George hired his wife, Marcia Lucas, who's a terrific editor, coming off of some pictures with Marty Scorsese.
Taxi driver among them.
Right. And Alice doesn't live here anymore, and New York. She originally asked me to join that team, and I started working on the opening sequences of Star Wars that had a lot of blue screen still at that time, and the visual effects were not produced yet or weren't completed yet. And then as we were heading toward the end of the year, or later that summer, that is, we brought on Paul Hirsch. So there was quite a team there. It's amazing that when you first enter these teams, you don't realize what you're going to learn, what you're going to acquire. You're going to have fights, or you're going to disagree. But I think we each brought different talents to different aspects of that picture, so that I learned from each of them things that I was able to apply later on in my solo efforts to other pictures.
Can you talk about I would say the courage of Marcia Lucas's way to approach to create momentum and say, don't worry about that. We just got to keep it moving, and the whole checkerboard cross-cutting. Can you describe that?
The way that George had written the script, like most scripts, as you would read it, scenes are written in completion, and they're shot that way. Like the scene has a beginning, middle, and end. And what I learned from Marcia was the cross-cutting between sequences in order to increase tension, so that you don't have to play out a scene. You can just play the first third of it, and you go to the first third of the next scene, and then to the second third of the third scene, and then when you combine them by intercutting the 2 or 3 scenes together, you add such an excitement to it because there's a forward momentum that they each add to each other. And that was, for me, another mind-bending experience, coming out of the conversation, coming out of Cuckoo's Nest, and now coming out of Star Wars. I was ready.
I think that the courage to trust momentum and your emotions and not worry so much about logic. I love that she inspired you that way. And you have to tell a story. I know you told it to someone who didn't actually air it. So this is the first time it's ever been told before the public. But I love this story about how the laser shots for the Star Troopers were not done yet, and you had to do something with a grease pencil. Will you please describe this?
So, you guys that haven't worked in film, you don't realize this, but one of the most valuable tools that you have as an editor when you're working on film is a grease pencil. And the grease pencil has this white, waxy residue, and you can mark up the work print. And so when we had these laser battles between Han Solo and the stormtroopers or whoever was shooting at each other, all you saw in the production dailies when you use that shot is occasionally you see a flash, a production effect that was actually photographed. You see a flash coming from the muzzle of one of the prop guns. And sometimes there wasn't any flash at all. You just see stormtroopers, raising their weapons, and you see Han Solo or Luke raising their weapons, and nothing happens. So one of the jobs that I was assigned was to use a grease pencil to mark the frames where the shots were coming from, which gun they were coming from, and which direction these laser shots would go. So we had to decide, okay, do we do this in 2 frames or 3 frames, where it would come from this gun and it would go this direction, and you had to kind of match in intercutting shots where it would be coming from. So, for instance, if a stormtrooper in the left lower frame, I would mark it up to exit the upper right frame, and then when you cut to the reverse and it's coming towards, say, Chewbacca, that it was coming in from the left top frame coming toward the middle of the right frame. So it was pretty painstaking, if you can imagine all the different gun battles there were.
Wouldn't you?
There's a lot of grease pencil.
I would have loved to see that. We're going to screen it for you right now. I wish. But you also had these little explosion bursts that you had to do.
Oh, yeah. Well, then when you hit that, you put a little starburst on it, It was just when I was young, 10 or 12, and I had to go to church, and you had to sit there and you listening to the sermon by the pastor, and I'll be drawing on the program, fighter planes shooting at each other, and that's what working on Star Wars when I was marking all these laser shots reminded me of, drawing in church.
See that? So the lesson of that is everything you do in your life ultimately plays out, right?
Absolutely.
So one of my pet peeves is that editors can get typecast. I don't think it's fair. You could say the same, I guess, for actors, but the truth is, what makes you a good editor, what makes for good editing choices and instincts are the same, no matter what genre. It's still about timing and emotion and story and character and sensitivity and visual sense and all whatever. All the things it takes to be a good editor. And they still get applied the same way. But what happens is often producers and directors type you when you've done a certain amount of films in a certain genre, and then they don't think you're capable of it. And you hit that wall, you almost hit that wall when you were going to do My Favorite Year with Richard Benjamin. The producers were concerned because takes place, it's sort of, the style is broad comedy because it's about an era in live TV, the Sid Caesar era, which was broad comedy. So the whole movie is kind of that style. So it's very different from anything you'd done. So what was that like for you, that experience?
Well, like Bobbie is saying, when you're going for a job interview, if it's different from anything that you've done in the past, you're questioned as to whether you're capable of that mentality or of those values. And especially, that was one of my first major Hollywood films, because the first 3 films that I mentioned were all done up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I eventually came down here to work, My Favorite Year was an MGM picture, and we got to work on the lot, and which is now the Sony lot. But at that time, it was remarkable for me to get in for an interview with Mel Brooks and Richard Benjamin. It's not like Bay Area hippies, that I was working with when I was 12. So when I got to, God, my age is so confusing. That's because I'm senile now and I just can't remember anything. So Mel Brooks, when he interviewed me, he says, "Remember, Chew, cut on the frame line." So, I didn't...
It's like, what?
If you guys haven't worked in film before, a frame is made up of 4 perforations, and then there's a frame line. And so when Mel said that, of course, I would laugh, but I was trying to figure out, was he just being a wise guy, or is he giving me a bigger truth? Because at that time, I thought he was just being a wise guy. But, in subsequent years, I think I realized he was speaking, if you can imagine Mel Brooks speaking metaphorically, ironically. I think he was trying to tell me, keep your eye on the big picture, the entire frame. Don't kind of like only see part of it. See the whole world of that scene, or see the whole world of that frame, and don't, short circuit it. And even though he may not have intended that, I gradually realized that that was probably a good thing to keep in mind, because I think frequently those of us who are editing, we're in a hurry to race through that scene, to get through that material, to get through that dialogue, and we might not be giving it enough credit, that character enough credit, or giving it the beats that the scene may require for an audience to understand it or to receive the impact of it.
So that's a good segue to, we're going to show our first clip. And this movie was made in 1982, and it stars Peter O'Toole as a kind of down-and-out movie star who's got a little bit of a drinking problem, and he's a little bit in trouble financially, and he has to satisfy his creditors, he has to make an appearance on this kind of 50s your show of shows kind of thing, Sid Caesar show, and there's this young kind of writer on the show who's supposed to sort of keep an eye on him so he doesn't get into trouble. And so he ends up going home to his very ethnic, it's Brooklyn, I think, his family, and having dinner with them. And this is 50 minutes into the movie. So we'll run the first clip, please.
Uncle Morty, how odd to find you here.
Why? I just caught the 7:45 elevator down from 6.
I assume Aunt Sadie is here also?
Not yet, but she'll be.
Uncle Morty, say hello to Alan Swan.
I didn't catch the name. Ooh.
Alan Swan, rookie karaoke.
Carroca.
There was a lethal bantamweight called Carroca.
You're looking at him.
I saw you fight in San Diego. Sailor Donovan.
Right.
Took him out in 3.
2.
Who knew the Chinaman was a fighter? To me, he doesn't open a mouth.
Still in the fight game?
Anyway, I married Benji's mother.
Benjamin, darling, how wonderful to have you to home.
I gotta get back to my meatloaf.
Mr. Swan, may I present my mother, Mrs. Belle May Steinberg Carroca of Brooklyn, New York, and Miami Beach, Florida, for 2 weeks each and every winter.
Benjamin, why didn't you tell me your mother was so lovely?
For me,
No, for me.
Mr. Swan.
Alan, please. And what may I call you?
How about yours? Oh, Alan, on behalf of everyone here, I would like to welcome you to our humble chapeau.
2 years at the Sorbonne, she still gets it wrong.
Al?
Ma,
What?
it's not Al. If I bring Capone or Jolson, then it's Al.
Jolson's coming?
Alan, I want you to feel perfectly free to do whatever you would normally do in your own apartment. Something to drink before dinner?
Some soda water?
Rocky! A glass of seltzer!
Take it off!
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Excuse me, Mr. Swan. I hate to impose, but I wonder if you would mind signing...
An autograph? Certainly.
if you don't mind, make it to Sadie Amorti Kronsky. That's with a K. The rest is the way it's usually spelled.
That's probably Aunt Sadie. Why don't you go open the door for your wife?
Thank you, Mr. Swan.
Alan,
Thank you.
your seltzer. A little liver?
No, thank you.
Sadie, you look beautiful. What a lovely dress.
You like it? I only wore it once.
Come and get it!
Dinner is served.
Rookie, your meatloaf Mindanao was superb.
Thanks. That takes 2 days to prepare, you know.
Really? Tell me, what was that rather pungent taste?
Parrot. And they're not easy to work with. They put up some squawk.
I can imagine. What was that dish?
Filipino pork and beans.
Where was the pork?
You can't. There's Jews here. So, I guess if you want to be technical.
What's the difference? So, Mr. Swan, now that we sat nice, broke bread together, shared a glass of wine, I feel I know you a little.
Morty, I feel I know you even better.
Good. Then you won't mind if I ask you a question.
Uncle Morty?
What are you worried? It's not personal. What was I, born in Minsk-Pinsk? I know my way around.
Morty, ask your question.
That paternity rap a couple of years
Morty.
ago. Did you stupor?
Morty.
Oh, wow. Did you go all the way?
Uncle Morty.
All right. Morty, I hope this doesn't lessen your opinion of me, but the answer is no. You see, people like me were targets. I'm blamed for a lot of things I had absolutely nothing to do with. On the other hand, because of who I am, I get away with murder in other areas. I suppose it all balances out in the end.
Does it really, Swanee?
Ma, he's an actor, not a river.
Swanee, can I talk frank to you?
Certainly, Belle.
Uh-oh.
Take a good look here. This is good. Sitting around with people you love. Some you just like, others maybe you could live without, excuse me. Sharing stories, sharing warmth. This is real life, Alan, and this is what you need. A home, and a family, and children. Huh? Hey, who knows?
Unfortunately, Belle, that part of my life hasn't worked out too well. Though I did produce a perfectly glorious little child. Her name is Tess.
See, you're a daddy, and this I didn't even know. So where is she?
She lives with her mother in Connecticut. I haven't seen her in over a year.
A year? Shame on you, Swanee.
Yes, you're right, Belle. Shame on me, indeed.
Well, time to go. What a divine evening. We must do this again real soon. Say, at the turn of the century?
The interesting thing about the scene is it was really played off mostly the secondary characters, and just reading a scene and deciding not only performance but what the scene is about, and going back to your discussion about reaction shots and what to cut to and like motivation.
Yeah, what's interesting about how the picture was cast with Peter O'Stoole, an international star, and he really doesn't have the punchlines. He has all the setup lines. So whenever he goes, in the other scenes, you would see that the biggest laugh lines are always off of other characters, and he plays it pretty straight. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he would be willing to do that.
Yeah, I just want to say there's an expression that Sam had that I love, which is never cut just for a line, only for a reaction. Which is kind of going back to what you were talking about on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest too, is think about saying a line, you already know what they're going to say. So you may not need that information, but the reaction, or maybe the reaction in the line, a reaction in the line, but not necessarily. And to just read a scene and motivate the cuts that way.
Right, to be able to see, like Benji, the young actor, Mark Lynn Baker, I mean, his reactions to show his embarrassment was much more telling
Exactly.
than what else was going on.
I mean, that's the real humor, his mortification. So, I mean, that's the best part of it, yeah.
Right.
So we are going to talk about risky business, but we're not going to show that next. We're going to talk about I Am Sam first. But just to reference it for later, that you went right into risky business after this, which is a totally different kind of comedy. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But so I Am Sam, this is a really interesting challenge for you. Once again, you're working with a completely different kind of director, genre, style of shooting that was very challenging, because for you, a shaky camera in the documentary world represents something different. And this is a story, Sean Penn has a brilliant performance as I have to say this politically correctly, intellectually challenged man who has the IQ of a 7-year-old, and he has a daughter, biological daughter, that he is in danger of losing custody of because he may no longer be capable of raising her. And so Michelle Pfeiffer plays his lawyer who's trying to help him get custody. And can you talk, so Jesse Nelson, the director, had this intent of shooting intentionally. The cinematographer was Elliot Davis, and they planned this way, that the shaky camera was a way of showing his disorientation and his confusion. And she was thinking that would make it less sentimental. But what was it like for you as an editor to deal with this footage?
Well, like you were saying, that the director felt that in order to work against the sentimentality of the story was to use a camera style that was rather documentary-like and immediate, but also just kind of very subjective. And, that was her choice. So, for us as editors, we have to go with the style of the camera style. I mean, it's gotten to be the point, probably starting from the 80s, because of television and commercials, that handheld cameras were used, and intentionally used in a way with a lot of movement. But if you've ever tried to cut the stuff, as you guys have, you know how difficult that could be in order to match anything if that's what you're trying to do. Similarly, here, I've had that challenge, but because Sean Penn is the kind of actor that doesn't repeat himself, so takes 1, 2, and 3 could be pretty different from his intensity, from how he's interacting with the other characters, where he is even physically on the set. So I didn't realize that. When I had the opportunity to work on this picture, I thought, oh man, I want to cut a picture with Sean Penn because he's such a good actor. And little did I realize the kind of handcuffs that are going to be put on an editor once you commit to that, because he gives it to you one way, and it may be the only time you're going to get that, and you're intercutting that with other characters. You're kind of, painted into a corner of what you can use because you can't repeat it again. So here you will see an example of not only what he did only once, but because of the movement of the camera, also that's another pair of handcuffs, because of where can you go from that. And Michelle Pfeiffer wasn't that way. Her style is so different from Sean's. She's pretty right on in terms of repeating herself, repeating only in terms of the dialogue, but she would give different colors to it. And, you could get back to her at least and kind of know what to expect. If you were to go back and cut back to Sean, it may not be what you would expect at all. So here, what we were trying to do was to enhance during this kind of training or this coaching that Michelle Pfeiffer, as his lawyer, is trying to give him for their impending court date for him to regain custody of the child. But we wanted to also end on an emotional moment where there's a bit of a connection, a human connection, not lawyer-client, but a human connection. So then that also then dictated a lack of cutting. So
we're going to show the scene, and we'll talk about it a little more after. It's an hour and 24 minutes into the movie.
Our strategy is we're aggressively pursuing a support system. Now I'm going to ask you, how are you prepared to help Lucy at school? Sam, I told you you have to stop saying that. It makes you look stupid. Okay. Try again. You say you will find her a tutor, then I say, how will you pay for it?
Could you slow down? Why do you eat so fast?
We've been over this a million times.
Yeah.
You found her a free tutoring service at the YWCA.
But I didn't. You did.
Can you grasp the concept of manipulating the truth? Not lying, just a little tweak here and there.
No. You're so lucky you get to play with Willie anytime you want.
He doesn't want to play with me.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. He thinks you don't want to play, maybe.
That's ridiculous. Of course I do.
Tweak.
Hey, I drove around after work yesterday till 9:30 at night looking for that friggin'
Sweet.
Raptor scooter.
Sweet.
Okay. So, what made you harass that young boy at your house?
I didn't harass that boy. You know it, Rita.
Sam, I'm pretending to be Mr. Turner, remember?
If I look at you, I'm gonna laugh again.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Turner.
Okay, I'm Mr. Turner.
Yeah.
All right. But who are you kidding? Isn't Lucy already smarter than you?
Yes.
You already buried yourself. You gotta do better than that.
I kinda think we're the same smart.
What does that mean?
I know the bus routes better than she does.
How does that make you the same smart?
Doesn't every parent want their kid to be smart?
That's true. But the issue here is that at the age of 7, Lucy is already smarter than you.
In some ways, but in some ways, I'm smarter than she is, I think.
Sam, you gotta be firm on this.
In some ways, I'm smarter than her. In some ways, I'm smarter than you, Mr. Turner. In some ways, I'm smarter than you, Judge McNeely.
Whoa, take it down. Hey. Okay. Want some marshmallows? This is my husband's. He'll never notice. He has 10 more just like it.
Okay.
Try it on.
Will you look that way?
No, in there.
I wasn't exactly sure how to tie this. Does it look bad?
No. Very, very good. Cross over once, and then loop this around and up inside of the neck, and then pull up on skinny part.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I love that last cut because I felt like he's always trying to catch up with what he's experiencing. He's processing it slower, and the intent and what you show in his eyes throughout this movie, this sort of the body language with the eyes and what's going on, and a window into his mind. But that little, otherwise it would have. If it ended before that, it would have been different.
Yeah, I think that, like I was saying earlier, that with this kind of erratic style of camera style and cutting style, that sometimes we rush moments too much and don't allow us to, like I was saying earlier, about absorbing the emotional moment. And I mean, with a masterful actor such as Sean Penn, I mean, just to see the change in his eyes, it's just so remarkable. I mean, every time I look at it, I'm just trying to study, like, wow, what process is he undergoing in order to evoke that? You know, with a picture like this that tends to have some over-the-top moments because of the circumstances, there's a scene later in the picture where actually after the courtroom appearance by Sean Penn's character, that he loses custody, and his daughter, played by a 7-year-old Dakota Fanning, is actually taken by the social worker. And it's shot in a very stylized manner with very bluish tint because of the tinting on the windows that come in. So the sunlight coming through the windows gives a bluish tint, and it's shot almost kind of in silhouette because it's kind of it's underexposed. And the dialogue was really kind of over the top because there was a lot of crying by the Sean Penn character and by Dakota Fanning not wanting to be separated from the dad, and then the social worker is trying to calm everybody down. And it got to be the point that the dialogue was grating on your ears, even though the intent was to have you feel very sympathetic toward this situation. So, as editors, sometimes you have an idea, but you're afraid to show it to the director because it's so different from what the director had intended. So in the case of this scene that I'm describing to you, and perhaps you can look it up if you have a chance to see this film on DVD, I took the chance of losing the dialogue entirely, and I put a piece of music over it and just played it as like an MOS scene. And after dailies, one day, I said to the director, I said, Jesse, I have something I'd like to try on you. I can put it back the way that you wanted, but I just thought you should see it like this and see how you feel. So I did show it to her. All the dialogue, which she was one of the screenwriters of, all of it was gone. And what we heard was a piece of temp music, which we eventually kind of duplicated, but it was a piece by a group called the Penguin Cafe Orchestra. They're an Australian group back in the 80s. Anyway, it's kind of off-center. I mean, it wasn't schmaltzy at all, because that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. But it was just kind of a little off-center, kind of acoustic piece. And it made that scene work. I mean, because she says, "Oh yeah, that's really great. Let's use that." So I never had to show her it with the dialogue in, and that's how we ended up releasing the picture, without the dialogue.
That's really interesting. Great, thank you for sharing that. So Risky Business was made in 1983, and really extremely talented writer-director Paul Brickman, who only made 2 films, actually. And this was very different kind of humor than My Favorite Year, which you did just before this, and very off-kilter, very unsentimental, very really depicting teenage life in a pretty unique way, very interesting approach to storytelling about a teenage story. And what we're going to talk about is probably the most well-known scene in the movie, which is the sex scene on the train. And the original version that he shot was going to use green screen, and it was going to be a stationary train. He shot it, actually, a stationary train. And you actually edited that together, right? And he discovered that it was sort of arty and cold, and it didn't really work.
Now, originally, this scene was written by Paul in a very perfunctory manner. It was like 3 sentences, like something like scene 83. Joel and Lana enter the train station. They get on a train. They make love on the train. You know, something as simple as that, just descriptive, no elaboration. So I think that he had expended so much energy in writing the other scenes with the dialogue and the character development that he thought he could figure this out once he was on the set. And what came back was something that, like Bobbie referred to, is very stiff, but he shot a lot of, it reminded me of, if you know any of the Michelot Antonioni films from the 1960s.
Blow Up.
Yeah, and it's very stylized kind of poses. And that's what the director, Paul Brickman, had shot originally for this scene, was Joel and Lana kind of in various sexual poses, I guess I could say. They were dressed, but it was against the windows of the train, which had green screen behind it. And it just, it didn't fit the kind of the freeness, the spontaneity of the characters in the course of the picture. But he did shoot a bunch of second unit stuff of train buys. Took place in Chicago, so it's on the elevated train in Chicago. And he just had trains of different sizes, going left to right, right and left, and so on. And it occurred to me when I was working with the dailies of this scene that what he really needed, even though it didn't say that in the script, I thought if we could find a visual equivalent of a sexual climax, that would be like really cool, you know, because they talk about sex so much in this movie, but there wasn't anything that was going to be explicit about it. So what if I could do something like that? So I tried with all the second unit stuff of the train buys going left and right. I just put together a sequence, and I showed it to the director and said, what if this were the end of the scene? So in a way, I was suggesting, here's the tail of the donkey, let's build the rest of it before this. So he had to go back and get some more additional scenes some months later anyway. So he contrived a new sequence to precede what we kept as the end of the scene. So what you will see, we'll talk about it again after we see it, but I just wanted to point out that this was fabricated in the pre-digital age. And, you know, I think now, given what we know of how we can use the tools like After Effects and Media Composer and so on, we could probably come up with this like in a day. But, you know, at that time, because we're working with work print and we had to go to optical printers and you had to figure out kind of by trial and error how to create this kind of time warp. It took us a while to figure out how to do this. So
you skip framed you at one point.
No, multiple frame,
multiple
frame printing
to create kind of a dreamy
thing. Now you have to realize that the way that he had written the opening, which we'll show after actually this, but the way that it was written and conceived was the Tom Cruise character Joel Goodson is telling you that this is a dream. You know, for this opening fantasy dream that he has of girls and stuff like that, because he's a 17-year-old boy with a lot of testosterone, right? So he's having this dream, and he's telling you this in the beginning of it. And then, of course, in the course of the story, he comes across a sex worker, which is Rebecca De Mornay, and then they have this scene. So in a way, editing-wise, I kind of helped design this going backwards, if that would make any sense after we see it.
Well, you'll see also the way you set up the main titles, but we'll run the sex scene first.
Finally, it was time to close shop. The girls were exhausted. Lana was hungry. She wanted to go out for a bite. She wanted to make love on a real train. Who was I to say no?
I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh Lord, and I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh Lord, can you feel it?
So you said nobody was gonna be here.
Be patient.
So I love your story about the two-shot and how you discovered that the L train, the lights blink when they cross the tracks, and so you took advantage of that.
Yeah, so, one thing we wanted to, there were several different takes that Paul Brickman wanted to use when the when Rebecca's straddling, sitting on Tom, but there were different takes. So we didn't want to use jump cuts because that would kind of destroy the mood of it. But I noticed that earlier in the scene, the train, when it crosses wires overhead, that the lights actually go out for a moment or so. So it gave me the idea that we could use short fades to connect the three different takes, and it would fit right in with the visual motif of the actual location where the lights would fade and come back on. So that was a device then we could use to connect those different takes.
And then what happened is they actually didn't have a specific plan for the very beginning of the main title. So Richard actually took some second unit shots that were intended for this scene and put them in the main titles. And we're going to run that so you can see how effectively it sets a certain tone and mood for the movie really beautifully. And notice also where Richard's credit is. This was the 80s. He could do this.
Well, let me just say something about using this footage.
Great.
Because, the best situation an editor could have is a collaboration that is fully, that flows both directions with the director. And in this case, because it worked out so well for the picture to have the step printing for this sequence that was like an hour and a half almost into the picture. What you want to do as a filmmaker or as a storyteller is to foreshadow certain moods or foreshadow certain styles. So remember we mentioned earlier that Brickman had designed like a green screen for this scene, which we eventually dumped, but he had shot the backgrounds for it, which was, for points of view of the train out through the window. So since we didn't use it for here, when we were actually already mixing the picture, and the producers started to freak out, like, wait, we don't even have a main title yet. What can we come up with? So Paul said, hey, how about that second unit stuff we used earlier? Richard, can you make something out of that like what we did, in the body of the picture? So I found this other footage, and then using the same kind of printing patterns and all that, applied that to what then we used here as the background to the titles. And then because of the duplication here for this DVD, toward the end of the main title sequence, the backgrounds look like they just go into black, but it's actually into the pupil, Tom Cruise's pupils and his eyes before it pulls back.
The dream is always the same.
Yeah, the guilds wouldn't allow that now.
Yeah, I
was
just kind of
pretty
made it
awesome.
under the deadline. I think it was maybe because of this that all of a sudden the cameraman's local and the art directors say, "Wait a second, we're more important than the editors." So their names come closer to the directors.
No comment on that. So we're going to talk about Bobbie, which is you're now working on actually the third, or just finished the third film with Emilio Estevez, who's writer, director, and actor. And this was made in 2006, and it's about it actually ends with the assassination of Robert Kennedy, but it's multiple characters, kind of Altman-esque, where you have all these stories that don't seem connected. They're mostly fictional, except I think the busboy is maybe the only one that's not at the end. And then at the end, they all come together, and they're all in the ballroom when Kennedy gets shot. And this is coming full circle, Richard, because your documentary background, now you're dealing with real documentary footage, and you're intermingling it with the footage that was shot for the film. Do you want to talk about the challenge of that?
So this was done back in 2006. Actually, we started in 2005. We finished in 2006. So I think the technology today, for those of you who have tried to mix documentary footage that was shot in other media and with the production footage that you're now working with, you probably have better ways to make them more seamless and to make them match better. But we back in 2005, 2006, we're working with news footage from 1968, and some of which was on 2-inch tape, because that was like news at that time. Much of it was on 2-inch tapes, and then some of it was on 16 millimeter film. So there was a mixture of that. When I was first brought on board, I read, Emilio showed me the script, and I read basically the speech that you would hear at the end here was a speech that Bobbie Kennedy made 1 or 2 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And Bobbie Kennedy was already campaigning in Indianapolis, and there was so much anger on the streets there that he, on his own, with his aides, went into a neighborhood in Indianapolis and made this speech, which was just a brilliant speech, almost spontaneous the way that he said it, but because he is so kind of learned and schooled, that he talked about about nonviolence as a reaction to violent political acts that had just occurred. And anyway, that was the thing that really brought me into this project when I read that, because it was a speech that, even though it was a lot of attention was given to it back in 1968, like the rest of us, we forget about things like that. So I was reminded of how impactful that was. So when Emilio told me that, we're going to get all this documentary footage, and then we're going to recreate the shooting in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, and I want you to intercut this stuff together. And like Bobbie was saying, this was like really full circle for me, because when I started in film, like I was mentioning to you, I'm a child of the 60s, so to speak, in that I was participated and I was subscribed to all the social action at the time. And then I came into Hollywood, and other things happened. But to be able to work with those notions again, and to work with footage from that time, it was like a really a new creative and technical challenge.
And the other thing that happened is that Weinstein Company made this, and Harvey Weinstein was concerned that young people would not really know enough about Robert Kennedy. And this was 2006. So, he wanted to have at the very beginning of the movie, which wasn't in the original idea, to show some, not only footage of Bobbie Kennedy campaigning, but also of Vietnam War protests, and just show that era, and then sprinkle little things throughout, like the way it is now, where they have some telecasts of him. So at first you were worried it would be feel like a biopic, which was not the intent, but it actually was a good idea, even though he can be, I mean, Harvey Weinstein.
Let me give a little background in terms of the script. Emilio Estevez had his original idea with the script was it was not about Bobbie Kennedy. It was Bobbie Kennedy was a character that came in the third act, and he wasn't even mentioned, but peripherally, and his appearance as a character came when he came to the hotel that night, right before his speech. The first 2/3 of the picture, or first 3/4 of the picture, were really about all these other characters, whether they were hotel guests, hotel workers, and so on, whether they're in the kitchen or they're in the hair salon or wherever. So it was in the style of, that Ernst Lubitsch picture, Grand Hotel. It was kind of like that.
And it was also challenging for you because all these actors were being paired. It was a low-budget film. There wasn't a lot of rehearsal time. There wasn't rehearsal time, and some stories were more interesting than others. Some performance, and I love that you said to him your strategy was going to be starting with performance first, and then worrying about all the structure and the transitions later. So I want to run the clip so we can have some time to also get questions and answers.
Kennedy, you son of a bitch.
Get the gun. Get the gun. Get the gun. Stay away from the gun. His hand is frozen. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. Hit his thumb. Hold him. Excuse me. Hold him. Get a doctor for the senator. We don't want to interrupt, Paul. Senator, please. Excuse me. Please, sir, move.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you please to be calm? We need a doctor to come to the podium right now. Please, everybody, please just be calm. And if you can, please leave the ballroom. We need a doctor to the podium right now. Please, is there a doctor in the house? We need you.
It is not a day for politics. I have saved this one opportunity, my only event of today, to speak briefly to you about the mindless menace of violence in America, which again stains our land and every one of our lives. It is not the concern of any one race. The victims of the violence are black and white, rich and poor, young and old, famous and unknown. They are, most important of all, human beings whom other human beings loved and needed. No one, no matter where he lives or what he does, can be certain who next will suffer from some senseless act of bloodshed. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Why? What has violence ever accomplished? What has it ever created? Whenever any American's life is taken by another American unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, by one man or by a gang, in cold blood or in passion, in an attack of violence or in response to violence, whenever we tear at the fabric of our lives, which another man has painfully and clumsily woven for himself and his children, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. Yet we seemingly tolerate a rising level of violence that ignores our common humanity and our claims to civilization alike.
Hey, Donnelly, what the heck's going on? Senator Kennedy's been shot.
You did a beautiful job of blending the footage and not just showing the right amount of the actual RFK material. But I love what you said to me earlier, too, about how the speech, which is the speech he was talking about, the one he gave, that was the one he gave right after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And you wanted to end with feeling that, what you felt from that speech, not the actual shooting. And that went on for 8 minutes. There's 3 more minutes of screen time after this of that speech playing over the footage. And it's just that it's ballsy and it held. And what was interesting, what you also said, is the previous sequence when he's actually giving the acceptance speech when they won the primary in California. That was not as interesting a speech because he's just thanking his workers and everything. And you played sounds of silence over that and just showed the footage, which was another ballsy choice, like what you did with taking the dialogue out of I Am Sam.
Right. Again, the writer-director wanted to have actually what Bobbie Kennedy had said in his actual last speech before he was shot. And because it would have taken away from the impact of ending the film with this speech, which was also the intention, that in order to keep him on stage at the podium at the Ambassador Hotel, to keep that alive, I took away his words and put in images of what he was talking about rather than actually hearing him, and then playing it with a Simon and Garfunkel song over that, just to evoke emotion before, giving you maybe some kind of hope in his words before this would happen to him.
So I think we have time for maybe a couple questions. Is that all right? Do you want to? You can call on whoever you want. Show of hands, questions.
There's no questions. Oh, there's someone right there in the middle there. Yes, sir.
That man.
Yes, sir. No, right. Yep.
So my question is about the music and Risky Business. And did you cut to the Tangerine Dream, or was the Tangerine Dream composed to picture later, or how did that work?
Okay. In the editing room, I found that the music, there's a lot of music in the course of the picture, and in the script, there were only 2 songs that were designated in the script that ended up in the picture. One was a Jeff Beck piece for an earlier scene, and then the Phil Collins In the Air Tonight, which was the first song in the train sequence. Now, it happened at that time, I found out that both Paul and I liked the minimalist movement coming out of New York in the 60s, 70s, and so on. So I used as a temp track some music from Steve Reich. Steve Reich was the predecessor to Philip Glass, in a way. So I was using Steve Reich, which is a minimalist kind of music. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a repetitive loop, and it adds a lot of percussive layers on top of each other, and it builds. And if you listen to it long enough, it becomes really mesmerizing and erotic. So what we were trying to do was to get something like that, but it was a little too intellectual. It wasn't like pop enough. So one of the assistant editors in the room, Albert Coleman, was playing on his boombox Tangerine Dream across the hall. And we heard that.
Yay to assistant editors.
Yeah, and listening to music that had nothing to do with the picture, of course. So, you know, Albert, stop listening to your music and get back on the train here. So, you know, we both gravitated to that. Who's that? He said, Tangerine Dream. This was like 1982, 1983, before, you know, they were really big in the States. So anyway, we transferred some of that onto mag film and tried it out, and it did work. And so the producer, John Avnet, decided with the director, hey, let's hire these guys. So they went over to Munich and actually had them record the music for the picture.
It's really great. But did you cut to the Phil Collins song or the original edit? Did you do?
No. Well, the Phil Collins song was in there. We didn't. But the train. We had the Steve Reich music.
All the way through?
Yeah.
Okay.
Until the end.
I think.
Yeah. Anything else?
One more question, I think we're.
This isn't a particularly complex question, but it behooves me to ask you, how many takes were there of Tom Cruise sliding into the living room?
Good question.
There were actually 4. I don't know why I remember that. I mean, I hadn't thought about it. I think when Ronald Reagan Jr. did it, he did less. He did that on Saturday Night Live after this came out and it was a hit, and Ronald Reagan Jr. did that same thing. But no, Tom Cruise did it 4 times for some reason. I mean, I don't remember. And he did, I think he only did 2 takes, though, where he actually danced around in his underwear and socks in the living room.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys. Thank you.